Today on the 21st show, we continue our week-long investigation into fentanyl, turning to the politics of the crisis. We'll talk with a reporter from Axios about how the consensus on opioids, a rarity in American politics, has become more polarized. Then we'll focus on Illinois, hearing two perspectives on policies here. State Representative Kelly Cassidy, a Democrat from Chicago who favors harm reduction strategies, and State Representative Patrick Windhorst, a Republican from Southern Illinois who's also a former prosecutor. I'm Brian Mackey, and that's all coming up today on the 21st Show, which is a production of Illinois Public Media. Airing on WILL in Urbana, WUIS in Springfield, WGLT in Normal, WCBU in Peoria, WNIJ in DeKalb, WVIK in the Quad Cities, and WSIU in Carbondale. But first, the news. From Illinois Public Media, this is the 21st Show. I'm Brian Mackey. All this week, we're talking about fentanyl, a man-made opioid that's responsible for tens of thousands of deaths every year. Earlier this week, we heard about the history of the crisis, how people deal with addiction, and strategies for helping people who are addicted to opioids stay alive. Later this week, we'll consider potential solutions to the crisis and consider how best to talk with young people about these drugs. Today, we're turning our attention to the politics of fentanyl. Later on the program, we'll be talking with Illinois State Representatives Patrick Windhorst and Kelly Cassidy, a Republican and a Democrat, to work through their perspectives on the crisis. But first, we're going to focus on the national political conversations around fentanyl. My first guest says the opioid epidemic was once a rare point of agreement in American politics, but with the rise of fentanyl, the dialogue has become increasingly polarized. Take Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida and a one-time presidential primary candidate, who, like many Republicans, talks about fentanyl in the context of the U.S.-Mexico border. This is from a rally in Iowa last August.
When they're coming across the border with fentanyl in their backpacks, and you've seen the videos and pictures. Sometimes they're armed, sometimes they have a backpack with the drugs in it. Our border's wide open. We do have pieces of a border wall, but it's mostly wide open. But with the places where there are the wall, they actually cut through the wall and they just come right in. When I'm president, if they are doing things like that and breaking into our country with fentanyl that's going to kill our citizens, we're going to shoot them stone cold dead. They are going to be done, and we are not going to put up with this anymore.
As part of the week of conversations we originally had on fentanyl back in January, I spoke with Caitlin Owens, senior policy reporter for Axios, and we'll start the show by listening back to that conversation. Because today's program's on tape, we're not taking calls live, but you can always share your thoughts by email. Our address is talk@21stshow.org. Okay, here now is my conversation with reporter Caitlin Owens. All right, Caitlin, we heard that quote from Governor DeSantis a few moments ago. How does something like that reflect the broader rhetoric we hear on this, especially from Republicans?
Well, I kind of want to start from just the very big picture here, which is that the fact that fentanyl is such a big part of our political discourse at all. When I started covering the opioid crisis, several years ago, it was something that got political attention, at least on the Hill, but it was in a very committee workhorse, put your heads down and work on it type manner. Now it's clearly part of the border conversation, which is a very high profile political conversation, but it also sneaks into kind of, very tangentially related conversations, right? Where I remember at one point during a threatened government shutdown, the first thing that Democrats are highlighting is the risk of a government shutdown on addiction programs and on the effort to address the fentanyl crisis. And so it's just really become a much more prominent political issue in the national conversation over the last few years. And I think that's a direct reflection of just how prominent of a national issue it has become to everyday Americans. So many people know someone who has either overdosed and died or is struggling with addiction. And, if you're a parent, you're worried about kids and fentanyl, you're worried about, what they might accidentally take. And so I think that this is just indicative of how much this crisis is shaping all of our lives now at this point. And just, to kind of circle back to the Ron DeSantis clip, yes, it has become a huge part of the border discussion, which is a highly political, highly divisive conversation. And so I just want to kind of start by the problem with that is that, yes, most of our fentanyl supply comes from Mexico. It comes across the border. The problem is it doesn't come through illegal migration. It comes through legal ports of entry, obviously smuggled, so not legally. But it's not coming in the way some of these Republicans are suggesting it
It's
is.
not in the backpack, right? This is in through the free trade agreements that we have with Mexico on semi trucks and so forth.
Right. And of course, we don't, some of it might be coming in a backpack, right? But the vast majority of experts say do come from those legal ports of entry. And so cutting down on, illegal border crossings isn't going to do much for the supply of fentanyl.
Yeah, you had a quote from someone in a story last year that said exactly that. If you could seal the border completely from migration or immigration or asylum seeking or whatever you want to call it, and it wouldn't make that much of a difference in the overall supply of fentanyl coming up. What
Right, right.
yeah, go ahead.
And that's, yeah, and I was just going to say that's a larger debate too about, I mean, one of the problems with fentanyl is yes, it's coming across the Mexican border right now, but it's man-made, right? So if the supply gets cut off one way, some experts fear that it's going to be fine another way. Someone else is going to make it and bring it or make it here.
Yeah. What makes the fentanyl crisis and maybe the opioid crisis more broadly so different from other areas of public policy?
I mean, I think as I was kind of hitting on earlier, one thing is just its ubiquity, right? And how many people know someone who has suffered from this. Um, and I think just when we're talking about the opioid crisis, it just keeps getting worse, right? And so it didn't start as a fentanyl crisis. It started as a prescription drug crisis where it was misuse of painkillers. And so then from there, it went to more of a heroin crisis where when we as a country started to crack down on the misuse of prescription drugs, that's when the illegal drugs kind of came in to take its place. And then it moved to fentanyl. And each kind of iteration of this evolution has just gotten deadlier. And so, what we've seen over the past, almost a decade now, probably around a decade, is just these numbers, they keep going up and up and up to the point where now we're seeing 100,000 overdoses a year. The vast majority of them are opioid related.
And this is I guess maybe one of the differences is this is a threat people can see in their own communities, right? It's not like climate change where maybe that's happening to people elsewhere in the country or elsewhere in the world and maybe it's going to happen really bad in 10 years. This is
Totally.
something happening now. Yeah.
It's happening in everyone's community, right? And so I think, again, the opioid crisis was in rural communities before, but now it's everywhere. It's in clearly in cities, it's in the suburbs, and it's not even just people who are regular drug users, right? Like it's impacting people who recreationally use drugs, but they accidentally take something that has fentanyl in it and overdose.
If you're just joining us, this is the 21st show. We're talking about the politics of fentanyl from a national perspective, so particularly how the rhetoric has shifted on this and the conversation has evolved as the opioid crisis has moved from, abuse of legitimate pharmaceuticals into heroin and now into fentanyl. We're talking with senior policy reporter Caitlin Owens of Axios. Joe is calling from Urbana on line 4. Joe, thank you for calling in.
Yeah, good morning. I'm calling in because I've worked in prevention for a long time, and I think the whole idea of why we're about 4% of the world's population, and we consume maybe 40 to 50% of the world's drugs and opiates and everything else. What is it about our culture here that makes us want to consume in despair so much? Why are we not? I mean, there's interdiction. You can try to stop the drugs from coming in, but what is it about us? 4% of the world's population consuming almost 50% of all the illegal drugs and things like that in the
Yeah.
world. Why aren't we talking about that?
Yeah, that is a great question, Joe. Thank you so much for calling in and sharing your perspective on that. And Caitlin, this is something that, this is an ongoing conversation, right? Demand versus supply in how you best fight the drugs. How has that conversation evolved with fentanyl?
Well, and just to Joe's point, I mean, he's getting at the root cause of this. Um, he, he is asking a question that, I don't think anyone knows the answer definitively to. That's a subject of deep debate, but it is the question, right? Why is there such high demand for drugs in this country? But more broadly to the debate over addressing supply versus demand, I mean, you have to do both. Um, but it's two sides, right? So when we're talking about stopping drugs from coming across the border, we're talking about supply, the supply issue. How do we reduce the supply of fentanyl in this country? But then when we're talking about demand, that's where you start to talk about addiction treatment and prevention, and medication assisted treatment, and how do you stop people from wanting, or in the cases of addiction, like essentially needing these drugs.
Yeah, no, and it is, I mean, you're right. That is a deeper philosophical conversation.
Totally.
And we talked with Sam Quinones, the journalist on Monday, who started out wanting to write
Um,
about opioids and despair, and where these drugs first began to be used in the sort of deindustrializing cities of the Rust Belt. And I guess, there's a way of looking at this where we sent factory jobs to Mexico, and now we are getting and not to pinpoint Mexico, like you said, these drugs will find another place to come from if even if we could have a perfect border control there. But we sent the manufacturing jobs away, and now we're bringing the drugs in, and maybe that is a deeper question. Let's turn, in the time we have remaining, from the national conversation to individual states, right? Because that is where a lot of treatment decisions are made, and certainly prosecutorial decisions in even more
right.
local than states. How are we seeing them reckon with the crisis?
Each state is different. We'll start with that. But I think a trend that I have noticed recently that is really interesting is, there was a lot of talk, and there still is a lot of talk about how to address people struggling with opioid use disorder or, addiction more broadly, with compassion and this idea of harm reduction, where how can you save the most lives possible versus trying to have kind of very strict red lines about drug use. And so we've seen some blue cities over the past few years adopt some of these ideas, especially on the West Coast with the decriminalization movement, and things like needle exchanges, stuff like that. But those blue cities are getting a lot of blowback over these decisions, and we're seeing some of them rethink them. And so I think we're at a really interesting point in time for those calling for those harm reduction strategies, um, where, the politics are kind of consuming that debate as well. And so I think we're really trying to figure out. I think that people really still believe in the idea of harm reduction, but what is the best way to, especially, including in these progressive cities that are struggling, what is the best way to implement the most life-saving forms of uh forms of treatment, or just forms of just the most life-saving policies, but also balancing that against the needs of everyone else in the city.
What have we seen? You wrote a little bit about Portland in one of your stories that I read, and some of the experiences that they've seen with decriminalization of certain amounts or smaller amounts of these drugs.
I mean, it's gotten really political. You're seeing a lot of pushback from, um, just from people who, I guess it's the idea of open drug use on the streets. And it's funny, I don't live in San Francisco, but I'm there right now for work. And that's another city that's really become consumed by it, where you're seeing, um, just accusations and work concerns about crime and drug use and homelessness all on the streets. And while obviously those conversations do not all overlap perfectly with the opioid epidemic, there is some overlap there. And so I think you're seeing blue politicians, at least, rethinking some of their positions. But we're really in the height of this conversation about how do you actually address these problems without choosing between, abandoning one population versus another.
We heard that clip. We started our conversation with that clip from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. I don't think there are very many people who expect him to be the Republican nominee for president. So, how do you expect the campaign that it seems like we're heading into? Do you see fentanyl factoring into that, actual policy discussions factoring into the presidential campaign this year?
I don't see how it couldn't. I think that for a presidential candidate to ignore the impact that fentanyl is having on American lives would be just to put their head in the sand. And I don't think we have any indication that either of the, likely nominees are going to do that. But I do think they'll talk about it in very different ways. I would expect Donald Trump, assuming he's the nominee, which he's the front runner right now, to talk about it in very similar ways as DeSantis has, very harsh on crime, very, violent in terms of Mexican cartels, and also very strict, no, kind of no tolerance policies towards drug use. And I think that, I do think that, and I've read some of Donald Trump's proposals on this. I do think both candidates will emphasize treatment. What that actually looks like could be vastly different. And I think that at the end of the day, both when politicians are talking about this, in the back of their minds is the cost of all of it. How much money are we actually willing to put forward to address kind of these drastic treatment needs?
Caitlin Owens is a senior policy reporter at Axios. Thank you so much for being with us today on the 21st Show.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up after a short break, we're going to be talking with two Illinois state representatives, getting their perspectives on this. State Representative Patrick Windhorst from Southern Illinois and Kelly Cassidy is from Chicago. That's coming up after a short break. I'll also mention again, as we have throughout the week, that if you know someone who is suffering from a substance use disorder, or maybe you yourself are experiencing it, you can contact the Illinois Helpline for Opioids and Other Substances. The number for that is 833-234-6343. That's 833-2-FIND-HELP. There's also a texting line and a website, and you can find that helplineil.org. More to come after a break. This is the 21st Show. Stay with us. It's the 21st Show. I'm Brian Mackey. As I've mentioned, we are talking all this week about the ongoing fentanyl crisis. And for the rest of the program today, we're going to focus on the political and policy dialogue on this here in Illinois. When we first broadcast this conversation back in January, we were joined by a Democrat and a Republican for what we wanted to be a productive dialogue on different approaches to the crisis. State Representative Kelly Cassidy has been a member of the Illinois House since 2011. She represents the north side of Chicago, including the neighborhoods of Edgewater and Rogers Park. And State Representative Patrick Windhorst has served in the State House since 2019. He is from Metropolis, Illinois, which is so far south in Illinois, it's practically Kentucky. Again, our show is on tape today, so we're not taking calls live, but you can still let us know what you thought by emailing talk@21stshow.org. All right, Representative Cassidy, I want to begin with you. You've, as I mentioned, been in the State House for more than a decade now. In our previous conversation with Caitlin Owens of Axios, we were talking about how the politics of fentanyl have changed the conversation around opioids. I wonder how you have seen those conversations evolve.
Sure. I mean, I think that what we have seen and is it's not an uncommon phenomenon, but when this crisis reaches more folks who are not in marginalized communities, when it has an impact, when impacts start to stretch beyond sort of expected areas of issues, you see more attention. And so this has brought so much more visibility and attention to the opioid crisis, that we do have this opportunity for really collaborative work across not just across the aisle but across regions. Whereas I think that there have been other similar public health issues that have been more isolated and more marginalized, and it's been harder to get that kind of attention.
Representative Windhorst, you were the state's attorney in Massac County along the Ohio River for a long time before you became a state representative. How did you see fentanyl and opioids more broadly affecting communities there in that time?
Well, fentanyl really came after I left office and became a state representative. It really exploded in Southern Illinois around that time. Prior to that, we did see opioids, and methamphetamine was the large drug that was impacting our communities. But with all those impacts that we've had, we look at getting people into treatment who were addicted or who were users of drugs and needed that treatment. That was a common thing that occurred not only in our county, but in other counties in southernmost Illinois. And my understanding is throughout the state is the importance of drug treatment in addressing this problem.
You know, that's something that's so interesting about this particular crisis is that, often things that affect rural southern Illinois are not the same issues that they're facing on the north side of Chicago. But Representative Cassidy, do you see similarities on this issue in what's happening in your district and what's happening downstate?
I mean, I think that what it has become is a near universal issue, right? Whether you're talking about someone who, their path to addiction was getting their wisdom teeth out, or their path to addiction was street drugs, and everything in between. Like the impact is the same, and I think that we have to take that universality and take advantage of it to find the solutions. Treatment dollars have always been stretched thin. This crisis has made that even worse. The criminalization of addiction has had much broader implications because of how widespread this issue is. And so there is a lot that we can and should do, and this should be giving us the impetus to really push hard.
Yesterday on the program, we talked with an official from the Department of Human Services here in Illinois about the state's plan to deal with overdoses in this crisis. And I want to ask each of you what you think of what the state of Illinois, the executive department, is doing and whether Illinois is really getting at the heart of the problem. And Representative Windhorst, I'll begin with you.
Well, one thing that was clear when I was a prosecutor, and it's still a need today, is the resources in rural Illinois aren't there to deal with addictions and the problems surrounding addiction. So to use my experience in the court system as an example, it was common for there to be lengthy waiting periods for anyone who was seeking treatment, particularly inpatient treatment. And it was almost universal that those individuals are going out of state to get that treatment. So there was a high level of frustration with those who were in the criminal justice system wanting to get treatment for individuals who needed it, and those who were seeking treatment, because the waiting periods would be oftentimes over 6 months before what we would say a bed would be available or space would be available for treatment. And then people would have to arrange to travel a great distance to receive that treatment. So I think when we look at what the state can do, it's making sure that all areas of Illinois have access to treatment and services that are needed.
And we got a text message from a listener about this, Peter in Rockford, this very point. He said, where are the detox facilities? Why is it so hard to find someplace to get through the withdrawal? Addicts fear the sickness more than they fear death from potential overdose. Why are we not providing the medical detox they need? Thank you for those questions, Peter. And Representative Cassidy, maybe we can come back to the state's overdose action plan, but what about that? Is that a problem in your district? Do people have a hard time figuring out where they can go?
Absolutely. That is, this is where that universality comes in, right? While there are greater numbers of resources available in our part of the state, the demand is so high that same wait period kind of those issues of not having a funded bed, not being able to stay local, having to wait a very long time, at which point you might have lost your motivation, frankly, or you might have already overdosed and died in that waiting period. and to Rep. Windhorst's point, these are also folks who may be in the criminal justice system. Treatment is part of their part of the sanction in the system, and is their path to avoiding deeper criminality. So we're not doing them or ourselves any favors by continuing to short this system and not fund it at the levels that are really needed. That those dollars invested in treatment and prevention and detox and harm reduction go so far, because we have healthcare savings, we have criminal justice savings, we have families that stay together when we're able to break that cycle of addiction.
And Representative Cassidy, I did want to give you a chance also to weigh in if you have a perspective on the state's overdose action plan, where the executive branch is putting its efforts in this regard.
We have to take a really comprehensive approach. So, one of the first bills I ever passed as a brand new baby state legislator was the Good Samaritan law that allowed people to be safe from prosecution if they called for help in the event of an overdose. That was a hugely important first step. But we also, as I said, we have to look at harm reduction. We have to recognize that treatment is not a one and done thing, that we can't stigmatize failing treatment. We have to just let folks dust themselves off and try again. We have to ensure widespread understanding and availability of overdose reversal medications like naloxone. That it needs to become as common as having condoms around, to have naloxone around, so that folks know to use it and know how to use it and know what it can do, so that a life can be saved, so that person might have a chance to get a treatment bed and get well and get back to a productive role in our world. So we all have to be rowing really hard in the same direction, and we have to do it in as many ways as it takes to reach everyone that needs to be reached.
If you're just joining us, this is the 21st show. We're talking about Illinois' approach to the fentanyl crisis from a political and policy standpoint. What effect that's having, what our public officials would like to see changed. We're talking with Democratic State Representative Kelly Cassidy of Chicago and Republican State Representative Patrick Windhorst of Metropolis in Southern Illinois. And let's go to the phones now. Maggie is calling on line 4 from Ottawa, Illinois. Maggie, thank you for calling in.
Hi.
I understand you. Go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
So my question is, my daughter Emily was 17 years old when she used the social media app to purchase a fentanyl-laced pill, and she died from fentanyl poisoning in 2021. And I'm just curious as to what our state is doing to start protecting our children, because every day in the news I'm reading about children dying from fentanyl poisoning.
Maggie, I'm so sorry to hear that, and thank you so much for calling in to share that. If you're willing to speak more about it, she didn't know what she was consuming, obviously. No. All right. Maggie, thank you so much for that call. I really appreciate that. And again, I'm so sorry for your loss. Representative Windhorst, I don't know if you want to respond to what Maggie had to say there.
And also, Maggie, I'm sorry for your loss. It's horrible and tragic what has occurred. And the state does need to take action and make sure our laws are adequate to address this growing crisis. I will highlight one area, which I don't know if it would have helped in your daughter's situation, but would work to address one of the issues you mentioned about those underage getting access or being unintentionally exposed to fentanyl. We had in Southern Illinois several cases of young children being unintentionally exposed to fentanyl, getting access to pills or other sources of the drug. And it was because of the recklessness of their caregiver that occurred, the parent or the person caring for that child. And essentially in Illinois law, there's really a gap that allows that situation to escape the criminal justice system. So I put forward a bill to address that. Now, I think in those situations, that is a case that needs to be brought into the court system. It needs to be addressed by the court and by the criminal court, and hopefully will lead to better outcomes. Of course, we all want to see a reduction in the use of dangerous drugs. I think that can be something that is addressed by our state policy. And we also understand that in addition to using the criminal justice system where appropriate, there has to be other avenues, other tools that are available and resources. So that way we are also addressing the addiction side.
Representative Cassidy?
Let me add my words of sorrow and comfort. I cannot imagine what you've been through with this. And I appreciate the way Leader Windhorst is characterizing it, right? Like it's what I was saying. We need that comprehensive approach. We do need to use the criminal justice system where appropriate to address folks who are preying on that level of ignorance, right? She didn't know what she was getting into, but the person who provided it to her certainly did. So yes, there is an appropriate role for the criminal justice system there, but that's also that place of recognizing that we need to make sure that kids know what's out there and what they're getting into, and that they have it in a believable and trustworthy way, right? Like I've got three kids, I've got, they're young adults at this point, but they're not necessarily going to buy what I'm selling in terms of explaining what something is. So we need to make sure that we're meeting them where they are and giving them the information to know that, it may look legal, right? We see a lot of that. We see that in the cannabis space as well with folks using synthetics, right? These synthetic drugs that folks think that they can get legally, around the criminal justice system, are as dangerous, if not more so. And that public education component is critically important, and it needs to reach us as parents, right? We need the messages that we can receive, but it also needs to reach our kids in the language that they can receive it in too, and in the formats they can receive it in. And we need to make sure that we're doing that. We need to be as visible on social media with the truth as these monsters are with poison.
And I would encourage listeners who are interested in that aspect of this conversation in particular to join us on Friday, when we'll be talking with someone who actually does work with young people, educating them about these dangers. There's actually a new law in Illinois mandating high schoolers to get education specifically on fentanyl. And we're also going to hear from some teenagers themselves about how they receive those messages and what messages they're hearing and how they think about that. If you're just joining us, this is the 21st Show. I'm Brian Mackey. We are talking about the politics and policy of fentanyl in Illinois. We've been speaking with two state representatives. This was originally part of a week-long series of conversations we broadcast in January. Kelly Cassidy is a Democrat, represents part of Chicago. Patrick Windhorst, a Republican, is based out of Harrisburg in southern Illinois. Once again, if you know someone who is suffering from a substance use disorder, maybe you yourself are experiencing it, you can contact the Illinois Helpline for Opioids and Other Substances. The number is 833-234-6343. That's 833-2-FIND-HELP. There's also a texting line and a website at helplineil.org. And you can find all of that information on our website, 21stshow.org. And I should mention, while you're there, you can also find all of our past programs, including the other ones we had as part of our week on fentanyl. We also have our contact information there, including how to join our texting group. We ask people in that group for their thoughts on what we plan to talk about on the show. We often share those thoughts on air. Again, the details for all of that is on our website, 21stshow.org. More with State Representatives Kelly Cassidy and Patrick Windhorst when we return. This is the 21st Show. Stay with us. This is the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. We are continuing our week-long series of conversations on the fentanyl crisis by today talking about the policy and politics in it. We spoke with two state representatives, Patrick Windhorst, a Republican from Southern Illinois, and Kelly Cassidy, a Democrat from Chicago. We got their perspectives on how we're dealing with the problem of fentanyl. As a reminder, we originally broadcast this conversation and the rest of Fentanyl Week back in January. So we're not taking calls live today, but you can always let us know what you thought by leaving a voicemail at 217-300-2121. That's 217-300-2121. Yesterday on the program, we talked about the idea of harm reduction and things like needle exchanges, educating people who use substances about ways they can do so more safely, keep them alive while they are choosing to continue using illegal substances. One of the ideas that's been floated in the Illinois General Assembly in the past few years is called supervised injection sites. These are presently illegal in Illinois. I want to share what one of our guests yesterday, Chris Schaffner with the nonprofit group Jolt, based out of Peoria, had to say about this. You'll hear him also mention Sam Quinones, the journalist we talked to on Monday's show.
So an overdose prevention site or a safe consumption site is literally just, we have trained staff who can respond to an overdose while somebody is using under a watchful eye, because that's the humane thing to do. Mm-hmm. Because what I do agree with Sam is people are dying out there on the streets, but they're dying because of bad drug policy and because of shame and fear of stigma. And if we can remove that and watch them and provide them medical care that they need, we will not only save lives, we're going to be more likely to engage people in more holistic services that can help them and benefit them and then benefit our community as a whole.
Representative Windhorst, I wonder what you think of a proposal like that. Could supervised injection sites address the crisis here in Illinois?
I believe we would be better served to put our resources into treatment facilities rather than safe injection or consumption sites. There's some evidence that shows that there's an increase in crime surrounding these sites in other areas, and I think we would be likely to see that in our state as well. I agree with what's been said throughout the week leading up to this point about needing to be compassionate and having policy that is compassionate. My belief is the most compassionate policy we can have is to give people treatment and to help them overcome their addiction and get into recovery. I do not believe safe consumption sites will lead us in that direction.
Representative Cassidy, I know you co-sponsored one of these pieces of legislation, at least in the past. What do you have to say about that?
I actually, this is one of the areas where Rep. Windhorst and I part ways. I think it's both and, especially given, as the representative shared, there in some cases up to a 6-month wait for a bed, while we are investing in added resources, added facilities, because quite frankly, as the recording showed, very often these sites are a great avenue into seeking treatment and seeking sobriety. And so, with those, the access to the sites, you have a safer way to ride out that wait while we work on cutting down the weight, but we're also going to be increasing demand for treatment by utilizing this harm reduction strategy. So I don't think it's an either or. I think that, as is often the case with complex problems, it's both and.
Representative Cassidy, I want to ask you about something else that came up earlier this week, and that is the journalist Sam Quinones. He's been covering this issue for 15 years. He's written 2 books about it, and he said that initially he was agnostic about questions of treatment and the proper balance between law enforcement and treatment, but he's come to have this view that he says will probably irritate or make uncomfortable people on both the left and right side of this issue, and that is, he thinks the more compassionate thing to do is actually to use the power of the law, arrest people, compel them into a detox situation, right? So you're using the power of the law because the current iterations of fentanyl and meth that are out there are so potent and so ubiquitous and so easily obtainable that people really can't the old idea of treatment where you have to wait till people are ready, they're just not capable of making that decision for themselves anymore. Now, we had some other guests who push back on that later in the week. I wonder what you think of that idea.
I mean, are we next going to compel people to treat their heart condition? This is a medical issue. This is a healthcare issue, not a criminal justice issue. Criminalizing addiction is no different than criminalizing cancer. If you choose not to get chemo, are we going to compel you to do that? It won't help because it is a healthcare problem, not a crime problem. Continue to go after the people that are pushing the poison by all means. But I believe that the better path would be to decriminalize addiction and destigmatize addiction so that people feel safe seeking help, so that people feel like they're not going to end up in prison for asking their doctor for help getting clean. I think that having the war on drugs has been going on most of my life, and using the criminal justice system to compel people into sobriety hasn't worked. It's killing people.
And just to be fair to say, I do feel like I'm protective of him because his argument is so nuanced. People should seek out his Atlantic article on this to get the full story. But Representative Windhorst, what do you think of that? What do you think of the proper balance here and navigating that's eternal question we've been facing here of, do you focus on demand? Do you focus on supply? Of course, everybody says, yes, it's both and, but is it 70-30, 60-40, 50-50? How do you make that balance?
I believe the criminal justice system plays a role on the supply side. I think Representative Cassidy agrees with that. But I also believe it plays a role on the demand side as well, to Mr. Quinonez's point, that jails, not prisons for those who are addicted, but jails do have a role to play. And that's why some decriminalization efforts for hard drugs, I believe, are dangerous. There was another guest you had on, I believe her name was Chelsea, earlier in the week, who, I believe her quote was, "By the grace of God, I went to jail, and now she is in recovery." I know personally of other people who are the same, who are thankful that they were arrested and went to jail and were directed into treatment. Now, I know Representative Cassidy's point that sometimes there can be too far in the criminal justice system on that end, and I do agree there needs to be a balance, but I believe the criminal justice system plays a role. Now, I understand the concern about how coercive should the system be in getting people into treatment, but there are, for people who are committing other criminal activity or engaged in other criminal activity while they're addicted, but the addiction is what is driving that activity, it's clear to me that the criminal justice system should be involved to direct them into treatment and to help address that cause the problem.
Subhash is calling from Peoria on line 4. Thank you for calling in.
Thank you for taking my call. I think some of this may have been addressed by the previous person. But we lose more than 100,000 Americans every year from this crisis. And it's been going on for many years now. I mean, you're talking about decades, except now with the fentanyl crisis, the number of deaths are much more common. We are talking about, I think, two parts of this: demand and supply, and prevention and cure. For the biggest bang for the buck really is taking care of the supply side and the demand side. And I don't understand. I mean, forget at local level, but at the federal level, why something is not done more aggressively regards to taking care of the supply chain for these drugs.
It's an interesting question, Subhash. Thank you for calling in and sharing that. I don't know if either of you, Representative Cassidy or Representative Windhorst, want to respond to that. We've certainly, as we heard at the top of the show today, a lot of the national conversation is focused on the border and individuals, although, as we've heard earlier this week, the real flow is through trade routes, legal border crossings and trucks that these drugs are coming in on. But go ahead. Representative Cassidy, I think I heard you there.
Yeah, I think that our first caller illustrated the complexity of that problem. We do absolutely have to look at what, where the supplies are coming from. But we also have we're existing in a universe where it's no longer a guy on the corner necessarily, where a kid seeming to be doing their homework at the kitchen table can be ordering via social media, and so it is a lot more complex than it's ever been, and those solutions have to be comprehensive. And I don't know what the solution is to the internet component of this. It's terrifying to contemplate.
Just about a little less than 5 minutes remaining in our time together. Representative Cassidy, I think you mentioned the word stigma earlier, and I wonder, I think that arguably you have done more than most people in Illinois to destigmatize cannabis consumption here. You were one of the authors of the legalization and commercialization bill here. And I certainly understand destigmatizing people who are suffering from substance use disorder. Do you think does that include destigmatizing the use of these substances? We had a guest yesterday saying, people should be free to do what they want to do.
I think that decriminalizing use, for sure, would go a long way towards reducing that stigma. Because the source of the stigma is that you're a bad person, that you're a criminal, not that you have a health issue, not that you perhaps are utilizing a product in a way that is helping with underlying health issues, like the folks that are microdosing psilocybin for depression, for example. Those are it is legitimate to contemplate who is using and why, and it is legitimate to remove the avenues for stigmatization. So yes, I believe that decriminalizing use would destigmatize use and would destigmatize seeking help for it, because you're seeking help for a health condition. You're not seeking help for a criminal issue.
Representative Windhorst, what do you think about that? Destigmatization of drug use in general.
Well, I oppose to it. Based on the comments I'm sure that I've made previously, that's not a surprise. I believe what we've seen in Oregon with the decriminalization of harder drugs should be a warning to the rest of the country that this is not a successful policy. That yes, we need to be compassionate in how we treat people who are addicted and how the various governmental systems, including the criminal justice system, handles these problems. But I believe that removing the criminal penalties that exist for hard drugs would be disastrous for our state and would lead to more drug overdoses and more deaths, as they've been seeing in Oregon. So I appreciate where Representative Cassidy is coming from, but I believe that the more compassionate approach is to treat addiction and to get people into recovery, not to destigmatize the use of these hard drugs.
We're going to leave it there. I want to thank you both so much for joining us. A lot of media attention goes to the most, angry and loud voices on these topics. But I think this sort of conversation does happen every day in government, both here in Illinois and across the country. So Representative Cassidy, Representative Windhorst, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your perspectives today on the 21st show.
Thank you. And thank you, Representative Windhorst, for being that guy that I can have these conversations with about any number of issues where we're not on the same side, but we can examine each other's views. You're a gift. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have conversations with you and the insight you bring to these issues.
Thanks.
That's all we have time for today. I want to mention again, if you or someone you know is suffering from a substance use disorder, help is available. Call the state of Illinois toll-free 1-833-2-FIND-HELP. There's a text line, and you can find all the information, all the ways to reach out at helplineil.org. You can get in touch with us on social media. We are at 21st Show on Twitter and Threads, and you can find every way to contact us, including our email and voicemail line on our website, 21stshow.org. That's 21stshow.org. The 21st Show is produced by Christine Hatfield and Jose Zepeda. Special help with this week's shows came from Christine Herman. Our digital producer is Stephanie Mosqueda. Technical direction and engineering comes from Jason Croft and Steve Mork. Reginald Hardwick is our news director. The 21st Show is a production of Illinois Public Media. I'm Brian Mackey. Thanks for listening. We'll talk with you again tomorrow.